Any questions? Okay.
I'm Assemblyman Michael Benjamin from the Bronx. I have one question
To do with the,
I'm sorry, let me look at the phone. I apologize, I have it in my mind. To Judy, I guess. The board work group, who comprises the board work group looking at economic development issues and the IP issues?
Wow, there was about 15 people there last week. Robert Swidler is one of the individuals on it. Ken Adams is the chairperson of that. He is the president of the Business Council, and he's also on our funding committee, and he's a great asset. David Holm, who is the vice chairperson of our board, and the commissioner both serve on that particular work group. Robert Klitzman is on it. Robin, he's on our ethics committee. And then there's, with regard to other people, Susan Solomon from the New York Stem Cell Foundation, and I'm looking for...
Anthony Giacchi.
What?
Anthony Giacchi from Kenyon and something or other.
Kenyon.
Intellectual property.
Yeah, he's an intellectual property attorney. Anthony Giacchi. I'm going to repeat that.
And these would be non-public meetings, would they not be? Or are they public meetings?
They are, yes, they are not subject to the open meetings law. There are members, because there are speakers coming in from Biospherics, Geron, and others, that I don't think any decision has been made to exclude the public at it, but technically they're not subject to the open meetings law.
Thank you.
And Michael Stocker.
Michael Stocker. Yes, I'm sorry that I'm not able to come up with all the members off the top of my head.
Fine, thank you.
Yeah, Jim, listening to your presentation, I hear about the Obama, Robert Swidler, General Counsel of Northeast South. When I first heard about Obama's executive order, I thought, well, that's going to take the pressure off of state funding. I think that may have been a lot of people's first thought. My second thought is, to the extent they're not funding the somatic cell nuclear transfer, the creation of new lines, that may actually increase the pressure on states to fund those kinds of the most controversial stem cell research. Is that your impression, or Judy, or anybody else's?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we're still going to have multiple sets of rules in play, and I think there's going to be a lot of demand from people who want to start moving into some of these things that are still, by federal standards, kind of outside the pale. But there are, do you know which states now can support SCT? Can California do that?
California can do that. Massachusetts can do that, but there is the issue of, when you're talking about SCNT, the lack of payment available for gamete donors, the oocyte donors, it does tend to be a barrier that has been repeatedly noted by the researchers in both of those states who would like to do that. Maryland, you cannot do that. New Jersey is pretty much stopped its funding. And Connecticut, it would also be permissible, but also there is a restriction against payment of gamete donors.
Martin Strasberg, Union Graduate College. This is a question for Jim and Judy. Jim, you're mentioning the tendency in California to go to clinical trials in 4 years as economic pressure. Judy, do you see anything like that in New York State, or that wouldn't be relevant for us?
It's very relevant. At the last meeting of the funding committee, there's a commitment to review our strategic plan each year, in addition to only having it initially be a 5-year plan. And that has been one of the topics that has been raised. There's a recognition that with $600 million, we would not be able to easily support more than maybe one clinical trial, because it does take $20 million is a figure that has been thrown out there in the way of a commitment. People are conscious of that. The funding committee had a dialogue about that, about including that, prioritizing that potentially, but the consensus was that we're at least a year early for being able to make that kind of commitment. There's a recognition that the science is moving forward so fast that by the time we would put something out there at this point, we may want to fund something differently or provide different direction. So it's still a new board. We still feel as though we have plenty of science out there to fund, and there is a desire to see those translational aspects of it to the extent that somebody would mention that, but it is not a criteria that is specifically looked at for funding. There's not a specific RFA out there to fund clinical trials, and I don't expect it will be in the next year.
No problem.
Sorry, I just don't see other questions. One of the interesting, I think it's primarily for Bonnie, if you don't mind, or anybody, but one of the really interesting issues in informed consent that we were talking about was how much do you disclose to a donor of their excess embryo about the kinds of research that might be done in the future, which is unknowable now. And a place where the rubber meets the road, it might be in chimera research. Do you really disclose to somebody that your cells or future derivation from your line might be used in mixed animal-human experiments? And do you give somebody the ability to opt out or write out exceptions from what they consent to? Does that make the whole thing unworkable? And is it starting to sound like the kinds of disclosures that legislatures mandate in connection with abortion to scare people away from abortion, weighing that against the ethical interest in giving somebody full disclosure is one of the areas that prompted some challenging discussions. So, any thoughts about how much you disclose about what your eggs might be used for?
Well, my area of research is not research. My area of specialization is not research ethics. But having said that, I will say that I would guess that you would want to have it consistent with other kinds of research ethics, and how much, when people are donating tissue, for example, what it's going to be used for. I think that you're right to suspect that some of the regulations that might be put in there might have an ulterior purpose of derailing the whole thing. And it seems to me that if people are willing to donate their embryos for research purposes, what they need to know is that it's research, it's not therapy, clear up any kind of therapeutic conception even on that end. But beyond that, it seems to me that you don't want to tie researchers' hands by saying, because you don't really know what's going to happen to specific eggs anyway, so it just seems kind of silly to me to build in too much information when you don't even really know what's going to happen anyway.
And I should just follow up on that too. CERN out of California has allowed, they said as part of protecting oocyte donors, they do allow restricting, someone donates something and they say they can allow you to restrict for future use. What's not clear is then, what have you explained to them? How are they restricting? What are they restricting to? I mean, are you disclosing all these different possibilities? And they're saying yes, yes, no, no, no. But generally, they do allow in consent form to restrict. You could write in that they could say, I don't want it for chimera research.
But could you say, for example, I only want it on basic research for fertility treatment. I don't want none of that diabetes stuff. I mean,
you potentially could, and what the researchers could do is they could say, I'm only going to take donors that allow it for unrestricted use. So there's a tension there. The one thing they do want to shy away from, though, is saying that you would say, I only want it for research that's going to benefit my, relatives who have a history. I mean, they want to make sure that you realize which goes to research ethics. They want you to realize it's not really for your or your family's benefit. It's for the.
Well, could you also, those that say I only want it to go for research into cystic fibrosis, but none of that sickle cell anemia stuff?
Potentially.
Yeah, I think it's a bad idea.
Bob Baker.
First, the real expert. Sorry about that. I'm sitting near a window, but I'm allergic to grass. But the sunshine's nice. The real expert, of course, is Sean over there on research ethics. But if you're teaching research ethics 101, the basic idea is if it's going to be anything that would make somebody want to say no, if they're a rational person, then they ought to be given that bit of information. How you give it, though, is very important. If you gave it in the way that Sean just did, in saying, we'd like to develop new drugs, and in order to develop and test some new drugs, we might want to use your eggs in combination with that of other animals to see whether or not these new drugs would bear fruits for human beings, would you have any objections? That would be a reasonable way of putting a potential use in a way that may or may not scare somebody off, but accurately states it, and if somebody doesn't like that mixture, they can say, no, I don't want to do that. Bottom line, if you're giving somebody, if you're using the tissue or the organ in any way that people might, if they knew about it, raise an objection to, then it ought to go in, and it ought to go in a reasonable way that explains sort of the benefits and the reasons for doing it.
The one thing I have seen proposed around this is sort of what Bob touched upon, because there's so much uncertainty about the direction of the science, is to have in there a section in which the person either says, do what you want with it, or puts in there a restriction that says, if the science moves forward and you want to use my donation for some other purpose, beyond what is in the original consent form, to come back and reconsent. And that's sort of the middle ground that I've seen taken in some other approaches as well.
Bob Moore there at the back.
Bob Moore with Rock Institute. Bonnie, I think you mentioned kind of in passing with regard to the Octomom, we don't really want to encourage octuplets. I think you were saying that kind of as a just an offhand personal comment as opposed to we should legislate against that sort of thing, although if that is what you meant, please correct me. But my question is, I think the discussion and the movement of this issue is propelled powerfully by things such as the desire for liberty so that people can do what they want to improve their own situation and that of humans in general, as well as, frankly, in this context, economic development in the state, business and jobs. Looking at it from the other end, are there things that we know that we don't want to do yet, or is it too early to say, to put anything in that category?
It's a very good question, and I would also point out that there's something between do whatever you want and pass a law, and that is professional guidelines, which of course do not have the same kind of teeth that the law does, but often do work in many ways. Full disclosure, I'm on the ethics committee of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and it and other groups have recommended we're moving towards a standard of single embryo transfer, although there may be conditions in which it makes sense to transfer more than one embryo. But I think there is widespread agreement, and now I'm talking not as a member of the ethics committee, but as an individual. There is widespread agreement among infertility specialists that implanting 6 embryos in a woman under 35 is unbelievable. I mean, nobody will agree that that was a good idea. But whether you want to have a law that says that you can only do that, as they have in Britain, where the maximum number is 2, or whether we want to stick with professional guidelines, is, I think, a complicated and interesting issue. As far as, are there any things that we absolutely don't want to do at this point? Well, there seems to be quite a great consensus that at this point anyway, creating embryos for reproductive purposes is not a good idea, if only for health and safety reasons. I'm sure people can come up with other things that people might want to do. There's a lot of controversy about things about genetic enhancement, but in terms of stem cell research, and by the way, I understand that escrow was so last year, and now we're talking about SCRO because these committees are not just looking at embryonic stem cell research, but all kinds of stem cell research. I'm sure there are going to be issues that come up and are just going to have to be debated and thought about. I don't think at this point the chimera issue is something where it's a line we can't cross. I don't think that we should be limited to surplus embryos, but there may be other things that as they come up, we'll say, yeah, we shouldn't really do that. Up in the air at this point, I
If I can add, in New York State, our statute specifically prohibits reproductive cloning.
Not SCNT though, right?
No.
No.
Any other questions, comments?
One last, if you don't mind. Is there a growing tension between the push for economic development and the, I guess, the medical scientific ethics of going slow and doing what's scientifically appropriate? As you're talking about California's private donors and others are pushing for results within the next 5 years, and then there's this, I think, an appropriate go slow approach that scientists have and doctors have when it comes to what's appropriate and what we're looking at. I mean, is there a growing tension for results?
I don't think that there is a tension, but it's not quite that one. I mean, what I think in funding terms it's translating into is putting more money into things that started out in adult stem cell processes, because those things were isolated, a long time ago. We understand a lot more about a lot more of them. And looking for those where the science is further down the line. Because a lot of the HESC-based stuff is still very much, we're trying to figure out how all this stuff works, kind of thing. So it's, for stuff at that stage, yeah, you want to go slow. But if you want to go fast, you want to fund other kinds of stuff. And I think that's where the tension is going to come.
And I don't know, I think there are unique issues in stem cell research. I don't know if the tension is, there's that tension in any kind of sort of biotech research that you have between what the science can do, what industry, if it supports it, what different sort of funders, what their motives might be. I think what's driving part of the tension maybe that makes stem cell unique is that there's so much hype in a sense around, the cure, if we, pass embryonic stem cell research, the cure is around the corner. And what's interesting is we talk, FDA just approved a clinical trial, but it's 10 patients on a spinal injury for safety and effectiveness. So I think part of it is we have to also think about how are we, as a scientific community from that standpoint, saying what we're doing and explaining and making it clear what we can reasonably accomplish and what we can't, which is why I think it's great, though, that the state gets involved, and especially in the basic science, because I do think that if the industry funds, there is more of an interest in results tomorrow that we can, profit from. So it's great to have states involved that are saying, no, we will fund, though, the basic science that you need to get there.
If I can add on that, I think in New York State, with the two different levels of review where we have our scientific peer reviewers reviewing the research proposals and looking at feasibility as one of those issues, and then also having the board take a look at it, and we really have a stellar board, and we're very fortunate to have the number of people with their credentials volunteering to serve in that kind of capacity. So I don't think that I think that tension will remain in proper balance in New York State. I do think that it's interesting when you look across into Asia and what you see on blogs and on the internet with regard to sort of miracle cures and the travel industry that sort of goes along with this, where in different countries there are real concerns about the lack of oversight, but yet people paralyzed, desperate for cures, looking at certain death, are traveling and willing to take those kinds of risks. And then that puts additional pressure on what is going on in the United States, and is the FDA going to be a barrier, and why can't we do this, and a little bit of the rumor mill outside of people who are really looking at the science and the ethics of it.
Just a comment, I think in California, the funding came from a bond issuance. And that probably translates to a lot greater pressure to come up with results. I think taxpayers in New York are probably a little bit more indulgent and less of a rush than bondholders are.
Well, I mean, California's already given out, I think it's like $600 million in awards. And the campaign for Prop 71, which was the proposition that authorized the bond issue, had its share of hype. And a lot of people were saying things about how fast things were going to happen, and how many jobs were going to be created, and how much tax revenue the state was going to get. And those things have not come to pass. And I think the governing structure of CERN, and particularly the kind of the Robert Kleins of the world, who's the kind of the godfather of Prop 71, who's a wealthy developer, I think are beginning to get worried that they've spent all this money and they don't have anything to show for it that's commensurate with what they promised. So I think there's a certain element of strategy in trying to shift from, what they originally went in business to fund, which was basic human embryonic stem cell research, and to shift into something that they can say, look, we got this. Here's what now it's probably not going to be the dramatic, cure for diabetes or Parkinson's or anything like that. It's going to be a little bit more closer to stuff we do now. But, they're trying to keep public support for what they're doing, and they appear to have concluded that they need to be seen as spending more on stuff that's going to get into the marketplace quicker. I believe our time is up and over. Thanks for being a great audience.